is no accident that Hawaii is called the Aloha State. From its earliest history, the native Hawaiians have expressed their spirit of aloha by welcoming others with open arms to their homeland. When Captain Cook and Captain Vancouver came to Hawaii in 1778 and 1779, they wrote about the generosity and hospitality of King Kamehameha and his people. Today, over 6 million visitors each year are lured to Hawaii in search of the paradise, so aptly described by Mark Twain as the most beautiful fleet of islands anchored in any ocean. However, in the eyes of the immigrants, these islands soon lost their beauty. Incredibly, this paradise rapidly created an ugly past, a past that was darkened by gross human rights violations. The bitter history begins to unfold in the year 1868, when the first contingent of Japanese laborers arrived in Hawaii. It was to be the beginning of decades of unimaginable physical, emotional, and spiritual suffering. When Emperor Meiji got word of the unjust treatment of his countrymen, he stopped further emigration to Hawaii. In 1881, King Kalakaua traveled to Japan to meet with the emperor and to express his concern. Wanting to secure the future of Hawaii, the king continued to promote goodwill between the two countries. And Emperor Meiji finally agreed to permit Japanese workers to come to Hawaii again. Thus, in 1885, the steamer City of Tokyo arrived in Honolulu with 994 immigrants from Hiroshima and Yamaguchi prefectures. This date marked the beginning of Japanese immigration that lasted for 40 years, bringing some 220,000 Japanese to Hawaii. These workers came with a vision of paradise and a promising future. Delighted, King Kalakaua rolled out a warm, welcoming mat to greet the newcomers. Like the pearl which develops in an oyster's shell when a grain of sand becomes trapped, the hot sweat, sacrifice, and tears of anguished Issei, trapped in a difficult situation, evolved into a precious heritage. For many Nisei, the most valuable gift they received from their parents was their religious and ethical training they received at home and at the many temples built and preserved by their Issei parents. This year marks the centennial of the first arrival of Jodo Shinshu, the way of the Nembutsu, to Hawaii in 1889. It is a time for all of us to reflect upon the theme for the year, a grateful past and a promising future. Namo Amida Butsu. It is a time for us to put our hands together in Gassho and express our gratitude to the forebears who brought Jodo Shinshu to Hawaii. Perhaps they did not find a paradise in the physical sense, but they did discover much meaning and satisfaction in witnessing the growth and success of their children and grandchildren. The first Issei came to Hawaii with high hopes and visions of earning a lot of money and then returning to Japan to live a better life. But their harsh working and living conditions dispelled any illusions they had. They toiled for 10 to 12 hours every day with low, demeaning wages, Except for Sundays, they slaved under the unsympathetic scrutiny of the Lunas. Dusk found them exhausted and eagerly seeking sustenance in simple supper, respite in bug-infested bunkhouses, and sleep on rough 1x12 wooden plank beds. Once established social customs eroded. Immorality, crime, and violence infiltrated the new community. Gambling, drinking, quarreling, prostitution, and even wife-stealing became commonplace. The history of Buddhism in Hawaii begins with the arrival of the Reverend Soryu Kagai, a Jodo Shinshu priest who had been quite concerned about the thousands of his fellow Japanese who had migrated to the middle of the Pacific and who no doubt needed consolation and spiritual support. In February of 1889, he embarked for Hawaii with the blessings of the Monshu, Myonyo Shonin, arriving on March 2nd. In September of that year, Reverend Kagai established two communities, one in Honolulu and the other in Hilo, then returned to Japan a month later, promising to return as soon as possible. But he never did. It is said that the Hongwanji doctrinal authorities opposed his idea that Amida Buddha and the Christian God should be juxtaposed and considered one. For several years thereafter, Jodo Shinshu followers were disorganized and disheartened because there was no real leadership in the Sangha in Hawaii. They asked Honzang in Kyoto for help, and the Reverend Ejung Miyamoto was sent in 1897 to assess the religious situation. The first official Hongwanji missionary, or Kaikyoshi, to be assigned to Hawaii, the Reverend Shoi Yamada, was dispatched. Then in 1898, the Reverend Honi Satomi arrived in Hawaii as the first kantoku, or superintendent of missions. With deep concern for his fellow travelers, Bishop Satomi lost no time in visiting the islands of Maui, Kauai, and Hawaii to spread the teachings. Soon his health failed, and he was forced to return to Japan. Early the following year, his health restored, Bishop Satomi returned, accompanied by the Reverend Emio Imamura. Reverend Imamura was asked to assume the heavy responsibility of bishop of the Hongwanji mission in Hawaii, a position he filled for the rest of his life. He distinguished himself as one of Hawaii's most prominent citizens because of his outstanding qualities of wisdom, compassion, non-discrimination, patience, and willingness to make positive changes. Bishop Imamura set out to build a temple for the Hongwanji in Honolulu. Reverend Yamada collected enough money from the members to purchase a temple site in Fort Lane for the sum of $2,750. To meet the building cost, $15,725 was collected, and within a few months a two-storied wooden temple was erected. A formal dedication of the new temple took place on November 20, 1900. The temple was overflowing with people, including many non-Japanese and newspaper people. One of Bishop Imamura's greatest concerns was the need, especially of young men and women, to learn English. Thus, special English classes were held at night as part of the YMBA activities. The YMBA also began publishing the magazine Dobo, or Brotherhood, and regularly held lectures on the essentials of Buddhism. Social and athletic activities increased, and membership soon reached 250. In 1923, a new building was built on 4th Street at the cost of $63,000. The Inter-Island YMBA Federation, which was formed in 1927, was in 1935 renamed Hawaii Federation of Young Buddhist Associations. The Honolulu YMBA retained the old name until 1947, when it was renamed Young Buddhist Association of Honolulu. The WBA, or Women's Buddhist Association, the Bukkyo Fujinkai, was inaugurated in May 1898. The 1,080 members pledged themselves to the 4 L's, namely life, light, labor, and love. On May 19, 1901, Mrs. Mary Ward Foster, a wealthy part Hawaiian Buddhist, attended the Hongwanji Ho'onko services commemorating Shinran's death. She brought a guest with her, the recently deposed Queen Liliuokalani. Her presence at the service caused quite a stir in the community and was reported widely in the newspapers of the world. The visit had a very positive impact and generated self-esteem and confidence in the young Buddhists. Mrs. Foster, a few years later, donated a large portion of the land on which the YBA, Fort Gakueng, and Hongwanji Mission School now stand. In the same year, the renowned Dr. H.S. Alcott of Theosophy fame gave a public lecture on Buddhism and created a wave of interest. His topic was Buddhism, the superior religion. In subsequent years, the Hongwanji hosted other very important persons, such as the Indian Rabindranath Tagore. These visitors all had tremendous impact on the Hawaiian community. In 1906, the Reverend Zuigi Ashikaga, who headed the Department of Propagation at the Honzang in Kyoto, arrived in Honolulu bearing the announcement that henceforth the temple in Honolulu would have the status of Betsuing, or detached main temple, and would serve as the headquarters of all the temples in the islands. The following year, the Hongwanji was incorporated as the Honpa Hongwanji Mission of Hawaii. The present Betsuing structure took 2 years to build, from 1916 to 1918, at a cost of $100,000 collected from members and friends from throughout the islands. The original building was narrower, shaped in a rectangle with a stupa-shaped dome in the back center and 2 spires located at the forward corners. The temple took on the present expanded look in 1954, when the front was stretched out and the spires were moved outward by several feet, giving the building a more balanced look. The Hongwanji Annex, located at the right of the temple, was built in 1963 to commemorate the 750th memorial anniversary of Shinran Shonin. In the early days, missionaries traveled to and from plantation camps on foot or horseback. They emphasized the dignity of manual labor and the virtues of thrift and industry. The ministers helped the immigrant workers with their letter writing, conducted funeral and memorial services, counseled the downhearted, discussed the problems of the community, arranged marriages, arbitrated family disputes, took in orphans, and helped to settle labor and management problems. They were also called upon to keep good, vital records. For the Japanese, the ministers served as a stabilizing force, bringing a sense of honor, duty, responsibility, and justice through a knowledge of the wisdom and compassion of the Buddha. Bishop Imamura played a key role in settling the 1904 Waipahu strike. He wrote that the inner nature of man was nothing but a monstrous conglomeration of greed, passion, and folly. The bishop identified himself too as one of the ugly human beings, and he encouraged the workers to follow the Buddha's teaching of self-realization, compassion, and wisdom. His earnest, sincere, and heartfelt wishes were answered. When he advised the workers to go back to work, the strike was resolved. Although the plantation life improved slightly, lingering inadequacies resulted in more labor disputes. In 1920, the Japanese sugar plantation workers went on a general strike. This time, the Buddhist ministers took a firm stand in support of the workers. The bishops of the Buddhist sects pleaded with the planters to seriously consider the demands of the workers, who were asking for an 8-hour day and $1.25 per day wage. The strikers and clergy supporters were called un-American. It was a bitter strike, and it finally failed. However, the social and political relationship between the lay and the ministers was cemented and served as a formidable force in the community. The immigrants began focusing their energies on building their communities and improving the quality of their lives by constructing temples, language schools, and practicing their religion. Caucasian teachers were asked to help the workers assimilate in American society. In October of 1921, Ernest and Dorothy Hunt, two people in sympathy with Buddhist thought, began to teach in Hilo. New religious centers were subsequently opened in nearly all plantation camps in East Hawaii. Reverend M.T. Kirby of California came to Honolulu to serve as at the 4th Street Temple, and his weekly classes on Buddhism enabled non-Japanese Buddhists and locally born people of Japanese ancestry to gain some insight into Buddhism. The Hunts, who had labored and studied on the Big Island, were called to Honolulu to receive ordination, and the Hawaii branch of the International Buddhist Institute was established. Many young people were attracted by the non-sectarian activities of the organization. In 1930, the first Pan-Pacific YBA convention was held in Honolulu. It was one of the most significant events in the annals of Buddhism. Reverend Hunt was sent on a tour of Europe and the mainland, United States, to solicit help from other Buddhists abroad. 170 delegates from the mainland, Hawaii, Canada, China, Japan, Korea, Thailand, India, and Burma attended the conference. Discussions focused on how to propagate Buddhism among the young people of the world and how to do away with religious bigotry. Early in the morning of December 22, 1932, a male member of the temple, hysterical with grief, ran into the study, screaming, "Bishop Imamura Maki! Bishop Imamura Maki!" Bishop Imamura was dead. The 65-year-old Hongwanji leader had died of a heart attack. Christians and Buddhists alike paid tribute to the memory of the most remarkable religious leader in Hawaiian history. Bereaved Buddhists mourned his death for months in public and private services. Bishop Imamura was a man who attributed all accomplishments to the benevolence of the Buddha. He wrote, "The entire karma of events through the decades are nothing but the manifestations of the compassion of the Buddha." After a brief interim tenure of Bishop Zuigi Ashikaga, who arrived in October 1933, Honzang appointed the Reverend Gikyo Kuchiba to be the next bishop. The English department was reorganized, resulting in the dismissal of Reverend Hunt and the appointment of Nisei ministers to carry on the work of English propagation of Buddhism. Several youth groups, the Seinen Kyodang or Youth Sangha, were organized prior to World War II. Many of today's active Hongwanji members were members of those groups. World War II totally disrupted Buddhist activities in Hawaii. December 7, 1941, found the Buddhist community preparing for Bodhi Day services at various temples. The next day, the temples were closed and the Buddhist ministers were interned. Labeled potentially dangerous enemy aliens, Buddhist clergy, language school teachers, community leaders, businessmen, doctors, were taken away to detention camps, passing through the assembly center at Sand Island. Most of the ministers were assembled at Santa Fe detention camp, but some with families with them were incarcerated at relocation centers such as Jerome, Manzanar, and Amachi. The echo of the Okyo, the chanting of the sutra, rang through the camps. Buddhist activities such as memorial services and Hanamatsuri were still a part of the lives of those interned, but life was restricted and hard. Back in Hawaii, the Issei were put into a state of spiritual and mental shock. The temple had been an important part of their existence, and now, due to a lack of ministers, loved ones could not even be buried with Buddhist services. A war was raging both in the Pacific and in distant Europe. 33,000 Nisei men and women from Hawaii and the mainland served in the armed forces. They performed their duties magnificently and dispelled any doubt as to their courage and loyalty. With most of the ministers interned, those who remained had to carry the full workload by themselves. Reverend Eigen Yoshikami and women ministers, the Reverend Kinu Hirasa, the Reverend Edith Ohara, and the Reverend Mitsue Yoshikami, worked hard to hold the Sangha together for 3 long, difficult years. A few months after the ceasefire in the Pacific, the ministers returned from the camps. Immediately after the war, the ministers and lay leaders came together to choose the first elected bishop, and after a series of deliberation, the Reverend Ryuten Kashiwa was selected. Every 3 years, an assembly is held to determine who the next bishop will be. After Bishop Kashiwa came Bishop Kodo Fujitani, Bishop Zenyu Aoki, Bishop Chitoku Morikawa, Bishop Shojitsu Ohara, Bishop Kammo Imamura, Bishop Yoshiaki Fujitani, and finally the present Bishop Junjo Tsumura. One of the most momentous decisions made by the Hongwanji after the war was the adoption in 1949 of a proposal to establish the Hongwanji Mission School, the first Buddhist grade school in America. In its 40-year history, the school has emphasized the holistic education of the child based on the concepts of Jodo Shinshu. In 1950, the first World Fellowship of Buddhists was convened in Sri Lanka. At the first meeting, the Dhammachakra, the Wheel of the Dharma, which we see today in the Boy Scout Sangha Award, and the inscription on the headstone, of a deceased Buddhist serviceman, and the multicolored Buddhist flag were adopted as universal symbols of Buddhism. In 1952, Monshu Koshio Otani and Lady Yoshiko Otani visited Hawaii for the first time and spent 42 grueling days touring all the islands and participating in memorial services, confirmation rites, and receptions. They returned to Hawaii again in 1954 to officiate at the 65th anniversary of the founding of the Hongwanji in Hawaii. On this occasion, Lady Otani attended an organizational meeting of the English-speaking women and conferred on the new club the name Upasika Society, meaning Buddhist Lay Women's Organization. It continues to flourish today as a fellowship and service organization. In the same year, the Buddhist Boy Scout organizations received the authorization from the National Council of Boy Scouts of America to award Boy Scouts a Buddhist religious award called the Sangha Award. The Buddhist Scouts were brought up to par with Scouts of other religious affiliation. The Sangha Award is used by all Buddhist groups, both here and on the mainland. Another project that received the support of all Buddhists in Hawaii was the effort to establish the Buddha's birthday as a holiday. The Federation of YBAs collected 40,000 signatures to petition the legislature. On April 8, 1960, a bill sponsored by Representative Jack Suwa and Senator Kazuhisa Abe became law, establishing Buddha Day not as a holiday, but a holy day. In 1967, the Third World Buddhist Women's Convention was hosted by the Federation of Honpa Hongwanji Buddhist Women's Associations. The minister advisors, recognizing the leadership qualities of the women members, designated more and more of the responsibilities to them. The statewide Fujinkai continued to support youth programs, including the student exchange and scholarship programs. Bishop Kammo Imamura was called from Berkeley, California, where he had been in charge of the Buddhist Study Center there. It was his inspiration that established the Buddhist Study Center also in Honolulu. In 1972, the BSC was opened for three purposes: a study center where lectures and study classes could be held, student center where students at University of Hawaii, Manoa could use as a meeting place, and a ministerial training center where aspiring young men and women could receive instructions not available at the university. Reverend Ryo Imamura was the first director assigned, followed by Reverend Will Masuda, Reverend Ryosho Kondo, and the present Reverend Yoshiaki Fujitani. Certain programs like the BSC summer session have continued. Every year since 1974, it has attracted about 30 participants, with some of the leading Jodo Shinshu as well as non-Jodo Shinshu scholars serving as instructors. The newsletter Metta was started by Reverend Ryo Imamura, and today the readership has extended throughout the world, and with more than 1,000 copies being sent out every month. The ministerial training seminar continues to be offered twice a year, in spring and in autumn, and the adult education series is given throughout the year. The Friendship Circle has been continuing for many years, and people from the community have graciously come forth to offer their time to share interesting aspects of their lives. The Buddhist Study Center Press came into being in 1977 and many original Buddhist books and translations have been published, attracting the attention of scholars from East and West. As part of the Hongwanji Centennial celebration, the property Makai of the center was acquired, and eventually the BSC complex will be expanded to include 4 buildings, namely the center, the director's residence, a visiting scholars' quarters, and a lecture hall. The Buddhist Study Center is rapidly becoming a significant avenue for the expansion of awareness of Shin Buddhism. The many seminars, retreats, summer sessions, and publications provide rich accessibility to the relevancy of Jodo Shinshu teaching. The strength of the Hongwanji, however, lies also in the vitality of the individual temples throughout the islands. While many of the Hongwanji temples have histories that go back 75 years, there are notable exceptions. Kahului Hongwanji became independent of Wailuku Hongwanji in 1955. Kailua Hongwanji was permitted independence from the Hawaii Betsuing in 1968, and Mililani Hongwanji was newly established in 1977. Mililani was a rapidly growing town, and it was decided that the entire Honpa Hongwanji mission of Hawaii would be asked to support the project of starting a new Sangha there. Thus all 35 temples throughout the islands pooled their financial strength to provide a spiritual home for young families in a new community. The success of that project warrants consideration of further similar projects. One very serious problem exists today, and that is the shortage of ministers to carry on the propagation of the Nembutsu way of life in our communities. To alleviate the shortage of ministers, a curriculum for adult education and ministerial training was developed in 1974. The ministerial training program continues today, and a handful of aspirants are continuing their study of Buddhism, intent on preparing for the ministry. As of December 1988, nearly 150 people have participated in adult education seminars, and nearly 30 people have completed 8 seminars covering topics required by Honzang to qualify for Tokudo, or minor ordination. It is interesting to note that 1/3 of the total participants were non-Japanese. BSC hopes to spark the interest of young men and women at the University of Hawaii Manoa campus to someday enter the challenging career of the Buddhist ministry. The future of Buddhism in Hawaii is definitely dependent upon these young people who have grown up in Hawaii. A recent program for youth which has been quite successful is the Young Enthusiastic Shinshu Seekers Camp and Seminar. Reverend Sandra Hiramatsu was concerned about bringing Jodo Shinshu to the youth. She sought to refocus the young people's attention on basic ideas taught by Shinran Shonin. The first YES conference was held at Camp Kokokahi in 1984, and it continues to attract a large number of young participants every year. To establish the foundation for the second century of the Hongwanji, the Hawaii Betsuing launched a fundraiser for the construction of the Buddhist Learning Center on the premises of the Hongwanji Mission School in 1987. $2 million was set as the preliminary goal for this multi-million-dollar project. The purpose of this project is to expand the Hongwanji Mission School to include intermediate and high school grades by the fall of 1990. As we celebrate 100 years of the Nembutsu in Hawaii, we reflect upon our grandparents and parents and sincerely thank them for the gift of life. This very moment is the now that cannot be repeated. By appreciating the rich past, we look forward with enthusiasm to the glorious future that lies ahead. Namo Amida Butsu.